I guess we just start off with you just giving us a bit about yourself. So name, degree, year, age, slogan, and colour.
And colour. Well, those last two should be relatively obvious, having come into the room with a green shirt that says "Vote Ed instead." So that's the slogan and the colour. Name is Edward McMahon, obviously. I'm 22. I'm studying law. I'm in my 5th year of that degree. I'm actually looking to do something completely different next year, yet to be decided. And is there anything else to that question? Or if that is? Cool, I'm done.
Excellent. Are you aligned with a political party yet?
Aligned or a member of? I guess they're different questions. I'm not a member of any political party formally. I keep company with a lot of people that are in the Greens, similarly people who are in Socialist Alternative and similar organisations, which I suppose you wouldn't strictly call political parties. But I'm not currently in a party. I don't have any imminent intentions of joining one, but my affiliation generally will be with the parties that are left of Labour.
Fantastic. Which of the other candidates in this election do you feel like you share political philosophies with?
Well, I feel that Liam Carrigan and I have some similar visions for the Union. Liam's a little younger and newer to university than I am, and I dare say that his political philosophies aren't fully refined, but I get the general impression that he's a left-leaning candidate who has some visions for some truly progressive change in the Union. Mm-hmm. He's somebody that I'm enjoying working with during the campaign, and if we're both elected, I very much look forward to working with him when that time comes.
And obviously you know that during the elections you have to do preferences. Which candidates are you kind of moving towards preferencing first and second? And if I can ask the inverse, which candidate are you most likely to preference last in the election?
Yeah, sure. Well, last is without a doubt Callum Forbes. Any student who self-identifies with the Liberal Party gets a final preference in my book. In terms of preferencing first, my personal vote is likely to go to Liam Carrigan as a second preference, and I hope to reach some kind of deal whereby that's reciprocated across our campaigns. But that's obviously something that it sort of takes two people to negotiate that kind of thing, or two teams, I should say. So I can't really speak any further on that. But that said, I sort of have good working relationships with quite a few. I have quite a lot of respect for, just judging on the past 2 days, Cameron Kakamu's campaign. He's got a lot of experience and passion. Ideologically, we probably don't agree on a lot. But he's somebody that I'm certainly considering as belonging in my top 3, but it's just something that I can't answer without having further discussions with the other candidates.
Of course. And obviously then, if you were to be elected, the executive elections would be imminent after you took your place on board. Do you have any idea on who you'd vote for president of the USU?
It's really tough to say. My personal experience has sort of, with current board directors, has been dominated obviously with Beebe and Tom because we have similar political affiliations. But outside that duo, I've come across Robbie quite a lot as the queer officer of the SRC. He's put a lot of effort into writing his review of the queer portfolio in the USU, which was a humongous document into which he put a lot of work and consulted with the collective quite a lot. So I have a lot of respect for Robbie, and looking forward, I can imagine Robbie is somebody who I'd seriously consider in an executive election, as well as Beebe, because of our similar political preferences. But that said, I see people who are really driven and committed to the union and progressive change in it, like Tara, who in particular around the Tom Rowie removal motion was very supportive, and she's also somebody that I definitely consider. But these are questions that can't really be answered until you, well, firstly, whether I'm elected to board, and secondly, the makeup of the grouping of people who are elected.
You're obviously someone who is kind of putting yourself forward as a student activist in a way, so I'm interested in getting your views on what you regard as the biggest issue kind of facing students in Australia.
Well, the budget comes out next week, as we know, and we're looking at a 36% rise in HECS. We're moving towards a system that, well, Chris Pine has described as one that he'd like to resemble the one in the United States, which is one that favours systemic inequality between the rich and the poor and the level of education that they receive. I think every student, to every student, the most important issue has to be education in the realm of activism, because it is a great social equaliser, and one that is so important to building a progressive future. So look, education activism is probably a priority, certainly in the short term, but also in the length of my degree. I'd say that that's been one of the hot topics.
Do you see a role for the University of Sydney Union in engaging in that political debate and trying to push it in a particular direction?
There's no doubt about it that it does have a place within that political debate. Its constitution was amended around the time that the Howard government in 2006 abolished compulsory student unionism, to state that the board and the union should be advocating for universal student unionism. And we see now Abbott and Pine attacking student unionism as well as education. Education funding cuts necessarily imply threats to funding for student services and amenities. And as a provider of student services and amenities, the USU should be politically mobilising to resist any attempt to make cuts to that effect.
What does that look like in practice, do you think?
In practice, I think it means that board directors take the initiative to liaise with activist groups on campus, to keep apprised of developments in education policy in Australia, and advocating for members of the union to actively support struggles against any proposed change, and indeed fighting for the reinstitution of the pre-2006 position.
Sure.
Obviously, with activism around education policy, there'd be quite a large degree of similarity between the opinions of board directors and students on the fight for universal student unionism and the fight for good education in Australia and good tertiary education. Do you think that the USU has roles in other activist fights, and what would those roles look like?
I think any student organisation is going to have a diversity of members, and they're going to come from a diversity of backgrounds. They're going to come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, they're going to be non-cis male identifying, they may be queer, they may be a person of colour. And I think any organisation with such a diversity of membership necessarily has to take some degree of direction from groups that are systemically marginalised and oppressed in our society, and necessarily in organisations to which these groups belong. So in that sense, it's almost axiomatic that the USU does have a role in responding and being reflexive to activist causes. Because I mean, you've got to define what activism is, I suppose, and here I'm sort of defining activism as the struggle of those who are somehow marginalised or oppressed to change dominant institutions or practices, to better reflect their membership of those.
So you would regard in the event where the interests of a minority group who are kind of necessarily going to have fewer students on campus or fewer students involved in the union, those interests, the board should act in those interests rather than in the view of the majority of students or of indeed its members? Yeah,
well, I suppose the important point to make in relation to that is that defining what the interests of an oppressed or minority group is can be a tricky thing to do. It requires you to take direction from those groups acting autonomously, and taking that direction into very serious consideration. Obviously, these sort of judgments, particularly when governing an organisation like the USU, are necessarily complex and uncertain, but I certainly foresee scope for greater consultation between minority groups and oppressed groups and governance structures.
So I suppose if I could take you to a hypothetical scenario where there was a direct opposition between a position being advocated by an autonomous collective, for example, and that being advocated by, or you think held by, a majority of the union's members, which of those would you preference in that situation?
Yeah, look, ideologically, my instinct would be to follow the direction of an autonomous group, but we've got to remember the members of the union are themselves diverse. So when I say autonomous group, I don't necessarily mean groups existing outside the membership of the union. But it may be, in your hypothetical, for example, that the majority of union members want X, but the majority, or indeed all, from the oppressed group that are going to be directly affected by the decision want Y. In that circumstance, I'm always going to choose Y.
Sure.
In that sense, people who are affected by a decision know better what its implications are and how it's going to affect them than the majority does. Majority rules is not democracy.
I'm interested in getting your perspective on what, in its current form, the most important USU program is and why it's important.
Okay, do you mean programs in the very strict sense of you've got the Clubs and Societies program and you've got the sort of program independent of that, like I'm talking sort of debating and issues
I think
like
more
that.
lowercase programs, so any area of USU spending, I suppose.
That's more important than another.
Yeah.
I strongly believe that the Clubs and Societies program is an important area and one in which funding should be maintained and indeed increased. I think it allows people to pursue very particular interests with people who are of a like mind. And in the way that it's structured, I think that it's quite a positive area of the USU. So I guess that is the short answer.
So you made a quick reference to funding there. I'm interested in, if you had to reduce the funding of a certain program, which program that would be?
It probably wouldn't be a program. It's more likely to be the salaries of executive staff, which is currently occupies around $10 million of the budget. That's all staff, not just executive staff. The salaries of the likes of the CEO and the senior executives in the union well, we're not privy to that information as non-directors. Your guess is as good as mine. But my inkling is that there's serious room for reduction in the amount that we're paying.
Do you have any idea of the measures that you take in order to reduce that amount?
Well, I suppose the measure is the reduction of that amount. It's reviewing the salary package or whatever that salary package may be, looking at how it compares to other organisations in the not-for-profit sector, I suppose, revealing it to the membership, which is along the lines of transparency generally, and seeing what the political reaction is to that. And then in terms of the procedural mechanisms, that's just the regular, it's up to the board to review the CEO's salary and approve it, and the CEO approves the salary of the other executives. But procedurally, obviously, that's a different question.
Sure. In your policy statement, you suggest that the staff potentially are acting in the wrong way now, have too much power, so you'd like to change the CEO to be from the not-for-profit sector, that the non-student board directors, their position should be abolished. What do you consider to be the role of the staff within the union?
Well...
should be the role of the staff within the union.
Yeah, look, the term staff in the union is often bandied around, and it's one that intrigues me, because when I think staff of the USU, I think the cleaner who picks up the dirty plate in Manning, or the barista behind the counter at the coffee cart at Fisher. But when people in popular parlance sort of use staff, particularly in hack circles, they're actually talking about executives. So if we're talking about executives, staff in that sense, I think their proper role is to advise student directors. They have security of tenure, they've been there for a long time. There are people who have been there for over 3 decades, and they know how the organisation works, they know it in and out, and they're an invaluable resource. They're there to advise. They're much like I hate to draw the distinction with a public service, but they're the same concept. They're there to advise board directors and guide decision making. The board directors, however, are politically accountable. They're elected by the members, the constituents, and it's up to them to make the decisions upon proper advice. So that is the role of the staff in that sense.
Yeah, sure. Moving on to kind of values positions within the USU, how would you have voted on the attempted dismissal of Tom Rowie from the board, and why?
Yeah, sure. I was heavily involved in a grassroots campaign, and I'm using small g grassroots, meaning general activist, campaign called Stand With Rowie, where we mobilised to advocate for his continued tenure on board. So, that alone suggests that, without a doubt, I would have voted for him to remain on board. That's both because I think he was treated unfairly in a procedural sense, and because I agree with his actions.
Yeah, sure. Do you think that there's a deficit of transparency within the USU right now?
Yeah, I do, particularly in terms of program funding and director spending. These things aren't published in full, and the membership really can't make an informed decision if they don't know where their money is going. And there's a significant amount of their money going to places that, well, our money, I should say, we just don't know where it's going.
And so would you leak information about the union in the event that you believed it to be important that its members knew it, but it wasn't perhaps necessarily in the best interests of the union?
This is the classic philosophical question of, is it sometimes okay to break the law if that law seems immoral? Of course, here we're not talking about laws, we're talking about the rules of the USU. There are hypothetical situations where I would believe the rules of the USU, be they formal or informal, are acting in an immoral way, and I'd act according to conscience. But I mean, the hypotheticals are so varied that, I mean, as a director, you have duties to the USU, and you have to abide by those duties. Those duties have been designed by legal mechanisms, sometimes over centuries, in order to ensure accountability.
Sure.
They shouldn't be lightly broken.
Okay, so in the event that you've spoken about, you want to have greater transparency about union spending and directors spending and all that kind of stuff, would that be the sort of information that you would consider leaking because you believe it to be in the best interest of members?
There could be a point at which I would.
Okay.
That point would be after every possible avenue had been exhausted to agitate for change and cause that change to happen, such that that transparency comes about by regular means.
Sure.
And that can include campaigning in order to have a general meeting to effect constitutional change that requires such transparency. So perhaps actually, I perhaps wouldn't leak that information, because if I couldn't get enough members to say we want this information, obviously there's no mandate for it. But that said, there's nothing that would stop me being out on Eastern Avenue weeks on end trying to get the 400 signatures or whatever it is that I need to create a constitutional change to make this transparency a thing.
Sure. I think a lot of what came out of the Rowie incident was the notion that Tom was acting in students' interests. I'm interested in what informs your conception of what the student interest is.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, we spoke before about the diversity of students within the union, and the interests of a non-cis male identifying student might be quite different from the interests of a queer student. Not to say they conflict, they're just different things. On those matters you take direction, or I would take direction, I should say, from those autonomous groupings. The student interest more broadly is informed by the fact that the USU is an organisation that's designed for the provision of student services and amenities, to use that particular language. So the student interest is that which is focused on provision of those services and amenities in full, fully funded education, in other words, and I'm using education broadly to mean not only in the classroom but beyond.
Sure.
Can we talk briefly about the last kind of year of the union and your reflections on what the presidency of Hannah Morris has been like and what the achievements or otherwise of her board and tenure have been like?
Okay, well, if we're talking about Hannah Morris specifically as president, we've obviously had a recent debacle, which your paper has covered, in which Hannah engaged in a project of deliberate deception, whereby she shielded information from her board members, denying them the opportunity, well, attempting to deny them the opportunity to make the decision that was probably theirs, namely to recommend the reappointment of the Senate-appointed directors. I certainly suspect, and there's a general suspicion, that this was motivated by a desire to remove Tom Rowie from board, and again, that's been covered in your paper. So that tarnishes Hannah's entire tenure in a certain way. That said, the organisation has maintained its position. It continues to receive a sizable amount of SAF. Those negotiations were undertaken competently. We've had members like Tom Rowie leak information, which I do believe was in the interest of students. So we have individual board directors doing things. I'd also jump over and mention Robbie's queer portfolio review, which is another great achievement. BB's Sex and Consent, well, it's a day, it may be a week in the future. There are a lot of policies that have been instituted and have been quite an achievement. So there have been successes throughout the year. It's unfortunate that Hannah's tenure is sort of tarnished by this debacle at the end. But generally, I suppose that's my answer. It's not good or bad, it's just many and varied.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned before that the Clubs and Societies program you see as one of the most important areas of union spending. What are your policies to do with Clubs and Societies?
Well, look, I've been a member of so many clubs and societies over my time here. I've been here for 5 years. I'm on the mailing list of clubs and societies that I haven't attended for years, but you know, it just sort of builds up. I think there's about 15 that I'm somehow on the mailing list of. But it's something that has been immensely important to me. In terms of, I've known a lot of people that have been on executives of clubs and societies. Never had the time to do it myself because I've always been a full-time student and a part-time worker because I need to sustain myself. But this year I've been the treasurer of Greens on Campus, and as soon as I did that, and also in my experience dealing with friends who were on the executives of clubs and societies, I've seen what an immensely bureaucratic thing it is.
Sure.
It can be quite difficult for the regular student, even somebody in my predicament, as I said, who has to work in order to afford to live and study full time. To do the 3 hours of paperwork it takes to run a club and society properly can be quite difficult. So one of my key policies around clubs and societies is to sort of make or do a review of the program and see how that bureaucracy can be simplified and it can be made more accessible to regular students who might want to start a club or an interest group. So that's sort of my former CNS policy.
Sure. For people who might not know about that paperwork, can you take us through why that bureaucracy is so laborious right now?
Yeah, well, it's difficult to see because, I mean, we all pay SAF, and that SAF is divvied up amongst the student organisations, as we know. The union has other sources of funding, and that funding is allocated to its various programs. CNS is one of those programs. It gets that funding, and then it allocates it to clubs and societies according to the number of people that attend their events. So you do an event prior, you do a form prior to your event, you do it after the event, and through a series of complex calculations, it's decided how much funding you get. Sure. So in this roundabout way, money goes from the student, well, it's a loan, it's the SAF, which goes on help or HEX or whatever they call it these days. But it goes from students to the USU, to CNS, back to students. So it's this bizarre roundabout loop. It's difficult to see why the full extent of the paperwork is necessary and why that process needs to be quite so complex. It's something that I personally don't have a great deal of experience in, and that's why the policy is review it. Okay. It might be that it's completely justified and I'll be eating those words in 6 months' time should I be elected, and I say, oh god, that paperwork was necessary. But it would be nice to explain to students why it is necessary.
Yeah, sure. Is there any ideas that you have to try and engage more students in clubs and societies? You mentioned before the difficulty that even you had, you're quite active on campus, you're interested in the union, you know about the union and what it provides. For those people who are full-time students, do have to work part-time, how can they become more involved in club societies and get more out of it?
Well, actually, for my first 2 years at uni, I didn't have an access card because at that time it was about $90. It's gone down to $75, but that's still a sizable amount. And in any 1 week, I just could not afford through the entire year to buy one. And every week I'd get paid, or every fortnight I'd get paid, and I'd be like, oh, this is the payback, I'm getting an access card, because I wanted to join clubs and societies. Yeah. But I just couldn't. I couldn't afford it. So one of my policies is to reduce or subsidise access card membership fees for Centrelink recipients or people in financial need. And there can be that's sort of an easy way to means test things. But more importantly, and should it not be economically viable to reduce membership fees, I want to introduce a payment structure whereby you can pay a couple of dollars a week or whatever it is by direct debit or whatever mechanism is necessary to institute the policy to make sure that everybody who wants an access card can get one. Because I've spoken to so many students who have been in the same boat. They've been like, we want an access card, but we just haven't been able to afford it yet. I mean, we're now in week 8 or 9. I probably should know that. And there are a lot of students that I speak to who are like, yeah, I don't have an access card yet because I just haven't been able to afford it. And you can't be a member of a club and society until you have, well, you can't be active in a club and society in a proper sense until you have an access card. So, yeah.
Sure. Cool. You've got a bunch of quite ambitious policies for environmental justice, things like installing solar panels on USU buildings, full divestment from fossil fuels. You mentioned that the USU has invested in a bunch of different companies that are involved in environmental destruction. You also mentioned that Tom Rowie had similar policies 2 years ago. He found out they were feasible, and yet the USU hadn't properly acted on it until now. Considering the trouble that Tom's had in bringing these policies, getting them passed, getting action on them, what makes you different?
Nothing makes me different. It simply means that we have another 2 years of somebody agitating for these changes, and if the political will isn't there, there's no way in the world that it's going to happen. I had the chance when I was waiting out the front to come into this interview to read your editorial this week, and you noted that the last 2 years there's sort of been a leftward shift in the board. Things are politically changing on the board, and if we can maintain the political will, particularly pressure from the left, from people like Tom, like Bibi, like myself, these things become more and more viable. Tom is a great role model, and the environmental policies that I have been largely model of him. I want to continue the work he's been doing. So yeah, not a lot makes me different in that sense, but I still think that policies are necessary.
So you would, if you got elected to board, see yourself occupying a role as an agitator and not as someone who was trying to build political consensus behind your ideas?
Well, as I mentioned, this leftward shift on the board over the last couple of years from a position where we have liberal control, well, not control, but intense influence, to a point where we have no liberal influence at all, and hopefully it stays that way. But this leftward shift means there's plenty of scope for people like me, people like Bibi, people like Liam if he's elected, to work with our colleagues who are to the left of centre, be they in Labor, be they unaligned, be they in the Greens. There's an opportunity for those who identify at least vaguely to the left to actually work together and create a power bloc that can create real change.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though your vision for USU is one that has it functioning in a role that is analogous to that currently occupied by the SRC. If you are unable to systematically go through and change the expenditure of the USU on its various programs, would you support allocating a large proportion of the USU's budget to the SRC to enable it to fulfil the role that it is currently performing?
Well, I'm running for election to the position of the board of directors of the USU, and that necessarily implies that my focus has to be on the interests of the USU and the members of the USU. It has 13,000 or over 13,000 paying members. It's a large organisation of people who have elected me to act in the interests of that organisation. My sympathies or allegiances to other organisations can't weigh in on that calculus. I think there are important, if not subtle, they may be subtle distinctions between the SRC and the USU, but they are there. The USU is a more campus-based organisation. The SRC can be a little more ambitious in its political projects. I think the USU should be a political body, but I don't think it necessarily needs to turn its direction, turn its eyes to the broader campaigns that the SRC sometimes gets involved with. I think the SRC has important work to do in advancing the interests of undergraduate students, both at uni and in society generally. But the USU has always existed as a more service-based organisation, which should be collaborating with the SRC wherever it can. So, yeah.
Having worked in both organisations, can you tell us areas of the SRC or areas of expenditure of the SRC that the USU would never replicate or emulate?
I don't think that there's anything exceptionalist about either organisation that means that they're best suited to do one thing. I mean, the structure in many ways is an accident of history, but it's what we have to work with. And the fact is that the USU has had that campus-based focus. The SRC sometimes has a more political focus, but it provides services too. It has a legal service, it has counsellors. Indeed, before CSU was abolished by Howard, the the union provided counselling services as well. There's always been duplication. They've always sort of doubled up in that sense. And I think in those areas where they do overlap quite significantly, they should be working together wherever they can, whether that's in SAP negotiations or down the track through the exchange of services or whatnot. So I have trailed off a little. Could you redirect me to the track?
No. You answered the question.
I
The question
answered it,
was
cool.
just about differences between US and
Okay, okay.
Yeah. Do you have any questions? No, that was great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Too easy.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks very much.
Well played.